The Mead of Poetry, part of the Viking Spirit by Daniel McCoy. After many long and tumultuous, yet inconclusive battles, the Aesir and the Vanir arrived at the bitter conclusion victory was impossible, because both sides were equal in might and in skill, so they decided to end their conflict peacefully and with mutual accord. To make their treaty official and to preserve a reminder of it for posterity, the two tribes of deities spat into one communal vat. When their spittle mingled, it fermented and formed a new divine being who belonged to both tribes, yet neither. Since he combined all their powers, he was the wisest being in all the cosmos. No one could find a question to put to him for which he did not immediately have a perfect, irreproachable answer. They called him Kvasir, fermented berry juice. Kvasir traveled through the cosmos dispensing his knowledge to anyone who had need of it. One day he came to the abode of two dwarves, whose names were Falyar, Deceiver, and Galar, Screamer. The dwarves feigned a desire to speak to Kvasir in private about a matter that was troubling them deeply. Once the god was inside their home and out of sight of anyone else, they cruelly murdered him. They drained his blood into a large container and brewed mead with it. They named their prize mead Odrorir, and anyone who drank of it became a formidable poet or scholar. When Kvasir went missing, the gods retraced his journey and inquired as to where he had been last seen. When they heard that Fjalar and Galar had been his final hosts, they went straight to their dwelling and demanded to know what had become of him. The dwarves responded with a contemptuous smirk and an assertion that Kvasir had been too wise for his own good and had choked on his overabundance of wisdom. Kvasir wasn't Fjalar and Galar's only victim, however. Soon thereafter, the pair invited a giant Gillig from a pleasant trip out to sea in their boat. Knowing that Gillig couldn't swim, the dwarves pushed him overboard once they had rowed a good distance from shore and watched him drown just for the sport of it. Afterwards, they rowed back to land and reported Gillig's death to his wife, pairing it was a tragic incident for which they bore no responsibility. They asked the giant's sobbing wife if she would like to see the spot where her husband had died, and she said yes. One of the dwarves found a pretext to go outside the house of the giantess before the others, whereupon he picked up an enormous millstone and carried it up to the giantess's roof. When she walked through the doorway and on her way out, the dwarf dropped it on her head, and she, too, died. The two dwarves agreed that this had been absolutely necessary, because the sound of her weeping had been unbearably annoying. But Fjalar and Galar forgot to get rid of the last remaining member of Gilling's family, his son Suttung, heavy with drink. When Suttung found out about the manner of his father's death, he flew into a rage, grabbed the dwarves, and waded out at low tide to a reef that had been submerged when the tide came in. There he had dropped Fjalar and Galar, intending for them to be drowned just as they had drowned his father. The dwarves pleaded with Suttung to spare them, but the furious giant remained impervious to their desperate entreaties. Until, that is, they offered something even more valuable than his revenge, the Mead of Poetry. The giant carried them back to their home, where they quickly took out the mead and presented it to Suttung. So, for a second time, the fermented saliva of the gods became the occasion for reconciliation between warring parties. Suttung poured the precious drink into 3 vats, and hid them deep beneath the mountain Hnitbjorg, pulsing rock, and appointed his daughter Gunlod, invitation to battle, to keep watch over them in that deep, dim chamber. The far-seeing Odin watched all this happen from his throne in Asgard. He felt that the mead belonged rightly to the gods, since the being from whose blood it had been brewed was one of them, and had been murdered in cold blood. He also craved the powerful elixir in order to expand his own already prodigious abilities, so he came up with a devious plan to obtain it. Odin left Asgard and came to a field where 9 thralls were mowing hay. He walked up to the farmhands with a whetstone in his hand, and asked them if they would like their scythes sharpened. The men had been working all day and their blades were dull. They welcomed the offer. Odin sharpened their blades and the men returned to their work. They immediately found that the scythes cut better than ever before. The grass gave way effortlessly as soon as the blades touched it. The men were amazed and asked Odin if they could purchase the whetstone from him. Odin said he was willing to sell it, but warned that the price would be steep. The workers insisted that they were still interested. So Odin threw the whetstone into the air a little above the thralls' heads. In their scramble to catch it, each cut the throat of another with his scythe, and all died there in the field. These had been the farm hands of the giant Baugi, the brother of Suttung. Odin, disguised as a simple traveler, and calling himself Bolverk, worker of malice, knocked on Baugi's door and asked for lodging for the night. Over dinner, Baugi told Odin of his anxiety over who would cut his hayfields, now that his workers had all mysteriously killed one another. Odin seized his chance and offered to do the work of all 9 men if, as his payment, he was given 1 sip of Suttung's mead. Baugi protested that he had no say in what Suttung did with the mead, and that his brother was determined to hoard it all for himself. But eventually Baugi agreed to Odin's terms, and said he would go with his new worker to help him obtain his payment, once, that is, Odin had kept up his end of the bargain. So Bolverk set to work. By the end of summer he had completed the harvest, the work of 9 men, and went to Baugi and asked for the fee he had been promised. The two went to Suttung's house. Baugi, with some embarrassment, told his brother of the deal he had made with his talented, industrious worker. But Suttung flatly refused to grant either of them even a drop of his cherished liquor. Baugi was ready to turn back in defeat, but Bolverk insisted on getting the payment his employer owed him, and suggested an alternative method to obtain it. The two made their way to Hientbjorg, where the disguised god drew an auger out of his cloak and handed it to the giant. The strong Baugi bored, and after a great deal of time had passed, he pronounced the hole complete. To make sure that Baugi was telling the truth, Bolverk blew into the hole. Chips flew back into his face. Baugi was either mistaken or was trying to deliberately deceive him. The now suspicious Bolverk told Baugi to keep drilling until he had finished his task. This time, when Baugi said he was finished, and Bolverk blew into the hole, he blew the remaining chips through to the other side, and he knew the hole was truly complete. If Baugi had harbored any doubts as to the divine identity of his guest worker, they were laid to rest when Odin transformed himself into a snake and slithered through the auger hole. Baugi jabbed the auger in after him, but Odin, who had anticipated such treachery, was too quick for him. Odin made it into Gunnlaug's cave, and Baugi stormed away in anger. When Odin came to Gunnlaug, he used all his charms on her, and she became smitten. He agreed to sleep with her for 3 nights if she would give him 3 drinks of the mead in exchange. Even though she knew she was betraying her father, she was so overwhelmed with lust for Odin that she consented to the bargain. After 3 nights, Odin downed the contents of all 3 of the vats of mead in 3 enormous gulps, shifted his shape into that of an eagle, and flew out of the cave and towards Asgard. Suttung saw the eagle fly out of the mountain, and guessed what had happened. He too transformed into an eagle, and took off in close pursuit of the god. When Odin reached Asgard, his fellow gods set out several large vats into which he could regurgitate the mead. He made it to his fortress just in time and disgorged the contents of his stomach. Since then, he has given out drinks of the Mead of Poetry to those great men and women who he has deemed worthy of such an invaluable gift. But to avoid being caught by Suttung, Odin had to spit out the mead in great haste, and a few drops accidentally fell from Asgard to Midgard without Odin intending them to do so. From these paltry droplets have come the abilities of all the mediocre artists and intellectuals that have since clumsily attempted to ply their crafts.